Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Magnus.
Good morning. We're so glad that you could join us again for our continuing study in the Word. We continue to trace through the International Sunday School lesson series, which brings us to this fall to the study of the book of Genesis. We just began last week and had a good look at the first 13 verses of Genesis, chapter 1, and now we're going to continue reading about creation, days 4, 5, and 6. Our study will carry on into next week as we're looking at this opening chapter of Genesis. Dr. Roberts and I are pleased that you're with us and to be with each other.
Good to be here.
As we continue our study of Genesis. Well, we had days 1, 2, and 3. And days 4, 5, and 6 are an interesting echo of days 1, 2, and 3.
Building on each of those three.
Yeah, right. So we're going to look at for a correlation between days 1 and 4, 2 and help me with this, 5, and 3 and 6, right? Yes. We won't say what that is, but we'll let that emerge as we discuss it. The first days of creation, periods of creation, featured calling into being light energy, which then caused a great evaporation when it came into contact with the watery chaos of the early primeval period. And this caused this evaporation to create a kind of an atmospheric dome over all things, the vault, the expanse. And that evaporation revealed the dry land, and the dry land naturally produced vegetation, and so things are well underway.
Yes.
But we come now today to the animals.
And it continues the emphasis that we saw last week in the stressing that God did this, and He did it on purpose. And as the world is developing, the direction of God is still evident as the world grows and things happen. The presence of God is definitely here.
Yeah, the presence of God, the power of God, and as you said, the purposefulness of God is so well brought out in these passages. We're also going to see some other themes that we noticed last week. The goodness of creation and the orderliness, the inherent orderliness of creation are some more themes that are going to be continued. So in a way, no new insights this week, but we get a re-emphasis on some of those old important ones. Well, let me go ahead and read. We begin our study today in Genesis 1, verse 14, and I'll read that text. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and to let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living thing with which the water teems, and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good.
Very good.
Now, we're not finished day 6. The next lesson, next week's lesson, we'll continue that because we don't have human beings yet.
Right.
And the human beings were part of the day 6 ordering.
We'll take a whole lesson just on human beings.
Right, right, as well we should. And then, of course, there's a day 7 of rest that follows this. So we still have a little bit to go in this account, this opening account of creation. Now, verse 14 reminds us that God is the subject of this, right? He's the subject of the sentence, and he's the subject of the account. And it's Elohim is still the word that's being used.
All through this chapter.
We're going to get an added name for God when we get over into chapter 2.
Right.
But for now, it's Elohim.
And there are several names for God used in the book of Genesis, and it was part of that beginning, that origins of population, but also of faith, that they began to understand God better, and finally, because of the covenant made with Abraham, there's that covenant name of God that's used especially. And we'll see that show up in chapter 2, but then later it'll be emphasized, and that's what we'll find recurring all through the Old Testament.
Right. So this word Elohim is a rather generic term for God that is similar to names for God all across the ancient Near East. But yeah, we're going to come to that distinctive name pretty soon here. We also see here the continued emphasis on God's speaking order into creation, which I think emphasizes the mindfulness of God, the purposefulness, the intentionality of God. God isn't pictured as a tinkerer in a workshop, making little models of animals and things like that. That's a concept of God as creator that you might get out of some other creation stories, but certainly not here.
Nor is he capricious or accidental in what happens. It's intentional, it's purposeful, it's good.
So we get the notion that this all flows from the mind of God. He's not a tinkerer, and he certainly isn't a capricious creator, the way we talked about in that Babylonian story before.
And the ancient peoples, as we've seen in different cultures in different parts of the world, often would worship the things that were amazing to them, and the sun and the moon became objects of worship for many of those ancient peoples.
Good point.
Not in Genesis.
Yeah. The sun and the moon and the stars are all created by God and are kind of like servants of God. They serve very important functions.
Right.
But you're right, not to be worshipped. And in every religion I know anything about, there's always a sun god and there's always a moon goddess. And then the stars are frequently to be worshipped, the constellations.
But Genesis emphasizes that they're useful, they're intentional, but they're not to be worshipped.
Right. Well, these lights shine in what ancient people viewed as kind of the vault of the heavens, the sky, the atmosphere, this expanse that feels and kind of seems like a dome over our heads. There's already light energy in existence ever since day 1. But here in day 4, we have a further refinement of that, right?
Specifying.
Into heavenly bodies that are light giving or light reflecting in the case of the moon. Let's look at the purpose for which God creates these lights. One that's mentioned in verse 14 is to separate day from night. There's that ordering emphasis that we've seen here, separating. And then the next one, it says, is to serve as signs. Now, in what way are the moon, the sun, and the stars signs? Do you have a notion of
it's
how that...
significant, partly the seasons of the year, but also it became important in the religious life of the people of Israel, that by certain times of the year and certain seasons, they worship in different ways.
And that definitely is the meaning of the next three words: seasons, days, and years, which the NIV translates the word seasons as sacred times. And that's not a literal translation, but it's not a bad translation, because it reminds us that for the ancient Israelite people, time was a sacred thing for them, and time kind of ordered their expressions of faith and worship toward God. So, for instance, there were sacred days in Israelite religion.
Sabbath each week.
Passover was a day, and Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. So
and even the new moon festivals, each month.
That was a day, wasn't it, of the new moon? Then there were years in their religious calendar: the sabbatical year every 7 years, and the
year of Jubilee,
every 50 years. And then there were seasons too, kind of week-long festivals that celebrated agricultural seasons.
And for Israel, those agricultural were connected to the historical, so that Passover and booths, and the Pentecost,
we're all connected both to the agricultural season, but also to their history of the Exodus and life in the wilderness. Good. So the sun and the moon can help mark the passage of those religious activities. I think there's another sense in which the sun, moon, and stars serve as signs, and that is they are a continual sign of God's presence and power and purpose in the world, and therefore in our lives. So they're kind of more generically assigned. You know, Paul in Romans says that Gentiles really should have had a better notion of the existence of one creator God. And the reason he thinks they should have is that they had the natural world as kind of a testimony, right?
Yes.
And they had that, and they should have had a better sense of the divine nature. So at least Paul thought that these heavenly, all creation, but including the sun, moon, and stars, served as signs to human beings as the presence and power of God in the world, the divine power. But human beings have a way of ignoring all of that.
But notice, you mentioned, as we were talking earlier, he made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, lesser light to govern the night. Doesn't call them sun and moon.
No, he doesn't. I don't know why. If that's another way in which he's trying to avoid turning them into gods.
The worship.
He doesn't even name them.
Right.
Yeah.
They're there for a purpose. God provided them.
Yeah.
But not to be worshipped.
I've often wondered why, or as a young person, I wondered why planets aren't mentioned here, because they're pretty prominent as well. But the ancient people viewed planets as stars, as wandering stars. So that would have been included in that as well. Well, verse 17 says that God, in fact, did this, created these lights, and reminds us of the purposefulness of this. Verse 17 kind of repeats verse 14, to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, to separate light from darkness. These things all have a purpose. And not only does God have a purpose in creating, but God has a purpose for each part of creation.
Yeah.
I think that's a very important insight
It is.
to have.
And it follows to say, and God saw that it was good.
Yeah. So not only is God not an accidental creator, what we see around us in creation, these are not accidents. And we're no accident, as we're going to learn next time. Verse 20 is interesting because it continues a theme we mentioned last week about God creating creativity within creation. We noticed that the land produced vegetation. And here in verse 20, we have the sea, the waters.
The water is teeming.
Teeming with creatures, as if that's the natural creative function of the waters. Water and air, birds and fish are mentioned here. Now, we noticed how day 4, the creation of sun, moon, and stars, kind of further focused day 1, the creation of light energy. What's the connection between day 2 and day 5?
Well, day 2 is a separating of the water and the dry land, and here we've got the birds and the fish, and we'll see the recognition that God's provided for them.
Yeah. So day 2, we had the atmosphere, which drew up much of the water and became a separation. So we had air and water, and now we get the creatures that populate the air and the water.
Right.
Yeah, so it's a further focusing. Day 5 is a further focusing of God's creative plan for the atmosphere and the seas. Verse 21 has this interesting little reference to God creating the great creatures of the sea. There's that word create, which is a kind of a special word in Genesis. It's not just the word make, it's a special word that we haven't seen since Genesis 1:1. God created the heavens and the earth. I don't know what creatures, what great creatures, I can imagine whales, I guess.
Well, Leviathan, whatever Leviathan was.
That's true, that's true, whatever Leviathan was. Some people think that was a whale, but we don't really know. So we get these creatures. Now, what about this phrase, according to their kinds, which we first meet here in verse 21? What sense should we make of that?
That's significant that each species is intended to reproduce and continue and eat, birds of a feather flock together. You still see that today.
Yeah. In part, that's a continuing evidence of the orderliness of creation, that animals procreate according to their kinds. There's kind of a separation there, as it were, among species.
Yeah.
And there's another sense, too, I think, in which God intends the existence, the persistence of the various species of birds and fish. We were reading in a commentary on this verse, on this passage here, saying if God intends these species to exist according to their time, to their kind, anything we do to bring about the extinction of one of those species is really counteracting God's will.
Yeah.
And it could be that some species have gone extinct just for other natural reasons, but there's some evidence that we have hastened.
Humans have helped.
Humans have
Too many
hastened
times.
the end of that, which may be a more tragic thing than we realize. It's not just from a museum perspective. Well, you know, there are no more dodos, so we just have to go to a museum to see. Maybe there's something deeply spiritually offensive to if we participate in the end of that.
As believers in God, if we take seriously what He's told us in Scripture about how the world happened, how we have it available to us today, we have a responsibility to take care of it and to recognize the presence of God in it and the purpose of God in it and protect it.
Yeah, and that begins with the recognition of God as the source of all that exists and the inherent goodness of what God created. That's a theme we saw last week. It's equally strong this week. Each day each day's ordering is called good. Yeah, we do have a responsibility, and that responsibility is going to be brought out in some ways even more strongly in next week's lesson, where we talk about the creation of human beings, and they have a purpose too. Just like the sun, moon, and stars had a purpose, human beings, and that'll connect back to the very point that you just made. Well, verse 22 is interesting. It uses the word blessed, which is the first time we've seen that word in Scripture, because here in Genesis, and God blessed them. And this isn't blessing human beings yet.
No.
This is fish and birds, right?
Right, the winged.
And the blessed directly connected to procreation. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, as it will be when we get to human beings. Very same language, be fruitful and multiply. Now, multiply doesn't mean do your multiplication tables, right? Increase in number. Fill the water in the seas, let the birds increase. So there's the fifth day. Birds and fish are good. All right, day 6 starts in verse 24, and here we get another emphasis on creation being creative.
Let the land produce.
Let the land produce living creatures, but again, according to their kinds. Now, how many different kinds of land creatures are mentioned here in 24?
3 categories.
Okay, help us sort that out.
Well, the livestock, I mean, cattle, sheep, flocks, goats.
So domesticated animals, that would be.
But then the creatures that move along the ground, the creepers.
The creepers.
Reptiles.
So,
we don't do so well on
amphibians and things like that.
And then wild animals, the beasts of the earth.
Okay, wild animals. So there's a separate category for the creepy crawly things, right? Which we're not always a big fan of.
They're not exactly domesticated.
No. That's interesting that they become a separate category, isn't it?
Whether that includes insects and creeping on the ground.
Yeah, so we've got potential at least of reptiles, amphibians, and insects for the creepy crawly things. Okay, well, they're all good though, right?
They're good.
Whatever
Sometimes we question
whatever you think of snakes or mosquitoes, they're all good inherently, because that's the way the verse ends. They were good. Now, we've traced the relationship between day 1 and day 4, day 2 and day 5, where each time we get a further refinement or focusing of creation. Help us with what's going on in day 6.
Day 3 was the separation of the dry land from the water, and so we've got day 6. You've got animals and the population.
The land creatures, land animals.
Humans also.
Yeah, and humans will join them in our next lesson. So there's more to come on day 6, and we have day 7. Well, we began last week's lesson by saying that the book of Genesis in general, and especially these opening chapters about creation and early events, put our focus firmly on God, and that the big question we should come to is is not when or how long ago or how long, but who. And we made that point before. So let's let's not leave this material without going back and reflecting a little bit. What gets re-emphasized here about the relationship of God?
Well, he's still involved in the world. It's not the clockmaker that set it in process and left it alone. God's still involved and still overseeing it and still blessing it. The goodness is marked.
It still seems to flow out of the purposefulness of God, the intentionality of God, and it also indicates God's desire for order in the midst of chaos. And even after God has done the separating of light and darkness and sea and land and all that, then there's further refinement. There's a further ordering that goes on here with the heavenly light-bearing bodies and the fish and the birds and the animals. So God is continually ordering and reordering and further ordering all of creation. And then I'm just so fascinated with this emphasis on how God, the Creator, shares one of His most distinctive characteristics, His creativity, with creation. And not just with human beings. I mean, human beings are creative, and I think divinely so, but the rest of creation is as well.
The fish, the birds, the animals.
The waters, the oceans. The universe is inherently creative, even as God is creative. We wonder sometimes about how the New Testament refers to us sharing the divine nature, and next week we're going to see that we're made in the image of God. And this doesn't mean that human beings are gods, much less that the sun is a god or the moon is a goddess. But it does remind us that God did create us in His image and intends for us to share many of God's divine characteristics.
And where various people have noted that when certain conditions exist, there's this spontaneous springing forth of life. Again, to those who are believers in God, we see the hand of God still. That He's created the world to be this way.
The water teemed with living creatures. The land produced things. So one of the things we get re-emphasized in today's lesson is the nature of God, the wonderful nature of God. The other thing is this inherent goodness of creation. It reminds us that the whole cosmos and the biosphere in which we live, whether we live in a town or a city or a farm in the country, we live in a biosphere of living creatures and land and sea and water. We need to be reminded that we live in the midst of a divinely created environment, and our care for that is an inherent part of our respect for God.
We'll see that especially as we come to humans. We have a responsibility.
See that next week. Well, speaking of next week, I hope you'll join us for our next lesson where we complete day 6 and talk about the creation of human beings. Hope you can join us again. In the meantime, have a great week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.